25 years ago, a peace agreement was crafted in Dayton, Ohio. Not here, or here, but here. It ended the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the longest siege in modern history in this city, Sarajevo. For better or for worse, back in late 1995, these places became connected and will be a page or a paragraph or a footnote in history books. Who am I? I'm one of the thousands of foreigners who came to Bosnia after the war, and one of the dozens who stayed. But that's a different story. So, one day, in early 2015, I was driving with this guy. This is Paja.
Vozimo se mi I priča ona meni kako ona pozvana na taj Daytonski skup u Dayton, tamo nekad, neko mjesec. Pa rekao ja, šta ti misliš da mi svi odemo dole, da mi njih pitamo šta su oni misli kad su taj Dayton stvarali? Su oni uopšte razmišljali o budućnosti? Ne samo da se to nešto priča, nego da mi njih pitamo. Kaže, dobra ideja.
And you know what? He was right. So over the next few months, we had serious discussions and decided we should send some regular guys to the Dayton conference. Regular guys. Not politicians, not men in suits, but average guys. These guys. To see the place that has shaped their country for a generation, and to ask the people behind Dayton, Bosnia some questions, and to try to get some answers. And so this experiment began. But wait, how did we get here? What is Bosnia and Herzegovina? What's Dayton? What's Yugoslavia?
Dobro večer, dragi prijatelji, da vas pozdravim. Ja neću dugo, par minuta, povodom večeras ovako finog ove godišnjice, 20. godišnjice. Ja sam čuo da kad je Clinton odlučio da se obustavi onaj prokleti rat, praktički kraj rata, koji je u stvari najviše zaslužan, to je Monika Levinski. Zašto? Pa Monika je u stvari bila pod stolom, radila je svoj posao naravno, zazvonio je telefon i Holbrooke je rekao, Clintone, hoćemo zaustaviti. Naravno, ova pod stolom, on, da! Ja vjerujem da je Monika zaslužna za to, definitivno.
That's how Paja would explain this. But now let me try to explain it a little bit. Yugoslavia came out of World War II and was in a weird place between the East and the West. It was communist, but split from the USSR in 1948, and over the next few decades, it had a very different experience than the countries behind the Iron Curtain. So who was in charge of Yugoslavia? This guy, Tito. His vision of communism, or socialism, was an interesting hybrid. He started the International Non-Aligned Movement. The Yugoslav passport allowed citizens to travel pretty freely, and there was a vibrant cultural scene. The system enjoyed popular legitimacy among most people. Tito died in 1980, and to this day, if you ask someone where they were when they first heard this news, they can tell you. A few years later, the 1984 Winter Olympics were held in Sarajevo and were celebrated as the best Winter Games ever. Then, a few years later, for Yugoslavia, things started to go downhill. The Cold War ended, the wall fell down. And in Yugoslavia, people who for years made their careers as communists rebranded themselves as nationalists. There were the first multi-party elections, and nationalists won everywhere. Yugoslavia started to be torn apart. Dubrovnik and Vukovar were shelled in Croatia, paramilitaries came into Bosnia from Serbia, and Sarajevo was surrounded by Serb artillery and besieged for 3.5 years. 100,000 people, mostly civilians, were killed during the war, and more than half of the population in the country displaced from their homes. What were they fighting for? It depends on who you ask. Following on years of failed talks, and then the Washington Agreement of 1994, in summer 1995, things on the ground started to change, and the United States finally decided to get involved. So for 3 weeks, politicians and lawyers from the region met on an Air Force base outside of Dayton, Ohio, and a peace treaty was negotiated and signed. There would be 1 country, 2 entities, 3 peoples, 10 cantons, over 140 municipalities, dozens of prime ministers, a lot of government, but not much accountability or functionality. So that's it in a nutshell. Let's get back to our story. So we decided we'd go to Dayton. And first we needed meetings, serious meetings, to think about the hard questions we would ask and to put together the team that was looking for Dayton. Our leader, of course, would be Paya. He was born in Sarajevo, is a driver, a fixer, and a rocker. He speaks English and Italian, and during the war was interviewed by some of the many journalists who came to Sarajevo to report on the siege. He's always liked good parties, good music, and the chance to pick up a guitar.
Bilo je dobro u početku rata, ona nismo išli u školu. Znači, nije bilo škole. A neće to dugo, kažu. I ja sam ostao u gradu, koliko god je to trajalo i trebalo da traje, da ga taj, eto, ovo čemu pričamo cijelo vrijeme, Dayton nije zaustavio.
So let's walk.
Razlog zbog kojeg sam ja ostao, to je bio jedan patriotizam ogroman, mislim. Svi smo bi bili za Bosnu i Hercegovinu. Pucalo se po gradu, grad je napadnut, grad se branio. Znači, osnovni prvi razlog je bio taj neki patriotizam. Ta neka ljubav prema toj novorođenoj zemlji. I to je to bilo u početku, to je bilo toliko vjere, ljubavi, zajedništva. Da je to baš ono bilo nešto posebno. Je.
Vidiš li ovaj grad? Das ist Wahnsinn.
The second team member was going to be Spaho. Spaho grew up in Sarajevo's historic Old Town and has had two consistent loves in his life, classic cars and beer. Music and parties gave his life flavor before, during, and after the war.
Sad ti možeš imati mnogo stvari, ali ne znači da ćeš biti mnogo sretan. Ali tada, u to doba, sa malo stvari ti si mnogo sretan. Još ako struja dođe, muziku odvrni i udri, puni akumulator, jer na akumulator muziku pušta.
The third guy would be Kamo. Some people call him Tiger, but that too is another long story. He lives up in the hills overlooking Sarajevo and has hosted countless cookout parties with great food and drink over the years.
Evo ko se boraca izvršilo samoubistvo zbog nemašte, evo i danas dane, znači on prvi ja koji sam, znači i borio se sve, kad sam pao bolnice, zdravstveno osiguranje, jedva sam završio zato što
But then he had some health problems, and he couldn't travel with us. So we brought in this guy, Niklavani. He's a hard worker, a vodka lover, and can sing along to all the old songs. You can always count on him for a joke, laughter, and comic relief.
Jarane, ja sam prije rata majke moje, nikad nisam pitao šefa kad će plata. Uvijek je platu dočekala materi moji, jelo se, pilo se, po čitavu noć, alahan, sjedi, pi, ujutru 15 do 6 na poslu odeš i vratiš se opet, plata non stop.
These guys were in the same brigade and spent a lot of time together, and they were just the sort of serious guys we needed. Next, we realized we needed visas. Who wouldn't give these guys a visa? So we filled out the forms and answered a lot of questions, and much to our surprise, they all got them. The US was going to let them in. And then we really had to get serious. What would we ask? What do people in Sarajevo think about Dayton? So on a sunny autumn day, we sent Paya out to the main street to do a vox populi, to talk to the people and to ask them what they thought about Dayton.
Gospođo, dobar dan, molim vas jedno pitanje. Šta mislite o ovoj Daytonskoj Bosni nakon 20 godina?
Ništa. Ništa, stoji na početku kako stoji, to je to.
I think it's shit.
Imate li neku poruku za političare u Daytonu, idemo tamo do njih da sjednemo s njima razgovarati?
I have a very good message. Keep your Dayton in Dayton and bugger off from this country. Thank you very much.
Jo, pa gdje ćeš nas to pitat?
Pa recite slobodno.
Šta mislimo? Ide samo unazad.
Unazad?
Unazad.
Mi ćemo sad ići u Dayton na ovu godišnjicu, 20 godina, idemo na taj sastanak. Šta bi poručili političarima dole?
Da promijene ustav. On je pomalo star, treba da se promijeni.
English, okay. What do you think about Dayton Agreement, who stopped the war in Bosnia 20 years ago?
I think it should be adjusted by now. It was a good decision back then to make sure that there is peace and there's a possibility for peacekeeping mission. But 25 years passed and it's overdue.
Da li mislite da mi bez Daytona se možemo svi fino dogovoriti i nastaviti živjeti u nekom bolje blagostanju?
Sam dilemi, da li možemo. Neko stvarno koči namjerno. Moglo bi se nadovati ruke sve, ali uvijek nešto fali.
Pa ja mislim da je više vakat da dođe do jednog blagostanja u Bosni i Hercegovini za ovaj napaćeni narod.
Imate li neku poruku za političare koji su nam to sve sročili i servirali?
Da sve ovo isprave, da živimo kao normalni ljudi, da nismo bijede i da nismo gladni, da imamo posla za omladinu i za sve.
So after hearing what some regular people think about Dayton, we wanted to speak to some experts. What questions did they think we should ask? What issues did they think were the most important? So we found some people in Sarajevo who could give us some more food for thought.
Verovatno da sam pogrešno odgajan u naivnosti, verujući u ljubav, poštovanja drugih drugačijeg. Nisam verovao da će doći do rata u Bosni i Hercegovini. Posebno ne u Sarajevu, kaže, uvijek je bilo ono priča kao, može u Bosni, u Sarajevu, ne, multinacionalno i tako dalje. To je bio pomalo jedan plašt. Onda, prvo vreme sam verovao da to neće dugo trajati. 2-3 mjeseca. Međutim, kad sam shvatio čime raspolaže taj koji je izvršio agresiju, napad, onda sam rekao 3-4 godine.
Dayton je djelo američke kaubojske politike kojoj je bio dodijao rat na Balkanu. Pritom nisu uvažavali ni argumente, niti su analizirali uzrok rata. Morate znati da je uzrok rata bio projekat Velike Srbije i da je on pripreman jako dugo, odmah poslije Titove smrti, a obznanjen je 1986. godine kroz memorandum Srpske akademije nauka.
Da bi se vratio onda kako sam doživio Washington, 1994. sporazum između Bošnjaka i Hrvata, doživio sam ga veoma negativno. Jer tog momenta je bio dogovor između Bošnjaka, Hrvata i rekao se u zakonu ostalih. Rekao sam, tada sam razmišljao, evo prve podele u Bosni i Hercegovini na način koji neće funkcionisati.
Retrospektivno, jel? Iz ovih cipela sada djeluje da je pun manjkavosti, kao što i jeste, ali na njemu se trebalo raditi tokom godina, zato sada i stalno govorimo o reformama koje su mu potrebne. Trenutno ovakav kakav je, naravno da je vrlo komplikovana situacija u Bosni i Hercegovini, neprivlačna za investitore.
Here, I can't believe we can't do better. This is El Dorado for crooks. Here, none of the biggies go to jail. Holbrook, who I saw at the 5th Dayton, he's marching around. He was the bulldozer, and svaki čast, he ended the war. But what did he say in his book to end a war? Good policy, not implemented, is bad policy.
Međunarodna zajednica, kad je uspostavljen mir, pogotovo zapadne sile, smatrali su da je posao završen i nisu u implementaciji tog Daytonskog sporazuma dali podršku i bili rigorozni, jer bez obzira što je on nakaradan, taj sporazum je davao mogućnost određene integracije.
Definitely the most important thing. It stopped it, and we can analyze it now and say, okay, there wasn't a winner, there wasn't a loser, and now we're in this, really, we're in this stalemate that doesn't work for anybody. And I agree, but for me, the most important thing is that intense human suffering stopped. It was supposed to be a temporary solution, and it's turned out to be a long-term solution, and it's sort of prolonged the state of war, at least in our heads. The only thing I fear more than Dayton is Dayton 2.
There was a sense that things were moving up in Bosnia, that things were moving in the right direction. And that continued probably up until the 10th anniversary. But I think one has to remember what the nature of that deal was. It was signed among, effectively among warlords, the people who had the guns. And their primary concern was, do I get to keep what I gained during the war? Now, I don't mean to create a moral equivalence among those combatants, but after the war, I think the dynamic that was set up through the Dayton Agreement demonstrated that their primary concern was about themselves and not about moving this country in a direction that worked for the overwhelming majority of its citizens. So it set up an oligarchy that we Americans pretend is a democracy.
Imate li neko pitanje koje ćemo prenijeti njima tamo u Dayton kad dođemo? Gospodin Divjak vas pita to i to. Šta biste im poručili ili šta biste ih pitali?
Hvala što ste zaustavili. Hvala što ste zaustavili. Ali zašto niste bili uporni da se Dayton, slovo Daytona realizuje u ovih 20 godina?
And then it was time to go. We packed our bags, went to the airport, and had some delays because of the weather, something pretty common in Sarajevo in November.
Si, imaš i kakve zarazne agente, kulture i puževe. Ne nosiš puževe?
But then we finally arrived at our first stop, New York City. The guys wanted a little time to rest and unpack.
Ima dodatni opremi u njoj.
Šljivovica, domaća rabota.
Okej. Znači kada ovo još malo poturimo. Ja ću se, čekaj si odmahni. Neka, izgleda će se to. Gdje baš 2 stolce. Ja, lako će, ja. Dobro jutro.
Dobro jutro.
Danas je 16.
Novembar.
Studeni. Hladni. Mi smo na Manhattanu, a na Manhattanu u stanu kod Brita and Randalla. Ovim putem želim se zahvaliti Brita and Randall za gostoprimstvo.
Hvala unaprijed.
Na 6. spratu smo zgrade u Manhattanu.
Sa prelijepim balkonom.
Prelijepim balkonom, terasom, lagano pijemo kaficu i danas idemo dalje da osvajamo New York.
Na Manhattan. Manhattan prvo da osvojimo, pa ćemo ostalo sve.
Then the next morning, we went out to see the sights, try out the local food, and just enjoy the streets of the city that never sleeps.
Evo, vino je spiritis. Vino je spiritis. Inspiration. How much do you want? How much? $2. Is it okay? $1. Okay, sure.
We even went to the building where Bill Clinton has his foundation.
Rockefeller Group. Ovdje nam je Bill Clinton fondacija. Idem ja da vidim ima njega gore da ga pitam.
But no luck. Next time we'll have to make an appointment.
I am Slobodan Milošević. Vas niko ne sme da bije, osim vaše i naše milicije.
Koja si ti budala? Napokon pravi espresso na Times Square-u. Talijanski. Thank you.
And then we found 2 people that we thought could help us to understand Dayton a little bit better. First, we went to Columbia University.
There was a lot of good things that happened, but I also saw the limitations of Dayton by my second year. And I began to understand that with a decentralization and a weakened central state, it was not going to be good if there was going to be problems. And we began to see those problems after Patty Ashdown stepped down in 2006. And the obstruction began, and war by other means really took hold. 9/11 changed the United States' relationship with Bosnia and Herzegovina. So what you saw was a Republican administration that was forced to deal with 9/11 and the consequences of 9/11, and then the money moved out of the region, the attention moved out of the region, and the United States ceded its former role to the Europeans. A lot of mistakes were made, and I think the biggest mistake that was made, in my view, is yes, we ended the carnage, but to write a constitution and impose it, I think it was perhaps one of the biggest mistakes. What's happened to the Bosnian people is not fair, in my view, that they've suffered enough, and that Dayton has prolonged their suffering, and that America has a legacy. And the job is not done, and we are not finished.
Duže smo Ujedinjene nacije, tu ćemo da pričamo, vidiš one nebodere tamo, to je sve tu Amerika veliko. Molim te, okrini se tu turski centar i oni imaju koji mi...
After that, we went to the United Nations and spoke to a journalist who could offer his perspectives.
Pošao sam nešto kasnije, iz kuće sam osluškivao šta će se dogoditi u Daytonu. I pošao sam sa uvjerenjem i sa zadnjim informacijama da je Daytonski sporazum propao, da se neće potpisati. Naime, i Amerikanci su na noć prije javili da je to propalo, da se neće potpisati. Došao sam sa znanjem, odnosno informacijom prema Ujedinjenim narodima. Skoro sam ušao unutra da Dayton neće biti potpisan. Nakon pola sata u Ujedinjenim narodima sam čuo da je i zadnja strana, pod navodnicima, dakle, bosansko-hercegovačka strana, Alija Izetbegović, pokojni predsjednik, rahmetli predsjednik, da je on odlučio isto da stavi svoj potpis i da će Dayton u stvari biti potpisan. Nažalost, Daytonska Bosna je omogućila, ostavila je okvir, postala je alibi za status quo onih koji najviše profitiraju u posljednjih 20 godina. Bilo da su to političari ili interesne sfere koje u sprezi sa politikom zarađuju ogromne novce. I imajući taj alibi, neću namjerno da kažem luđačka košulja, kako je to rekao Richard Holbrooke, ali imajući taj alibi, pa Dayton je kriv za sve, onda se ništa ne mijenja. Svi oni kažu da niko nije očekivao da će Dayton biti trajni sporazum, nego privremeni, a da smo ga mi, Bosanci, na neki način, dakle, očekivali su više od bosansko-hercegovačkih političkih lidera, postavili da on izgleda kao trajni jer je poslužio kao alibi za ono što su oni radili.
LaGuardia Airport, aerodrom. Kupili smo hamburgere, kupili smo po pivu, oderali su nas. Čekamo let za Dayton. Opet smo jutros imali neki kašnjenja, malo svega toga, ali dobro.
And so the first stop on our American tour came to an end. We felt a little more prepared, so we set off for our next stop, Dayton, Ohio. We had managed to get an invitation to the main Dayton 20 conference. There were a lot of diplomats, professors, and activists there. Paya tried to talk to as many as possible, and we got better at interviewing as we went along.
Look at you. You want me to look at you?
No. We will.
You want me to look at the camera, or you want me to
No,
look
we
at
will
you?
talk. We will
Yes,
talk. Camera
okay.
will look.
Okay.
So, can I go?
Yes.
Okay. Edward, thank you very much that you find 5 minutes for us for a little project.
Yes.
Looking for the movie to give us few answers. And
Sure.
I got all the same questions for everybody.
Yes.
So, When Dayton Agreement was signed,
Yes.
what was your first thought? First thing that go through your mind in that moment, 20 years ago?
Thank God. Thank God the war is over. This was a diplomatic triumph led by Richard Holbrooke to end the war, but a deeply flawed agreement that contains the roots of the problems that we have in Bosnia today.
Since 1992, I'm proud to say some of my bosses in the U.S. Congress were calling for military intervention at that time to bring it to an end. And so it was again also a little bit bitter and sad because we know that it could have been different had there been that earlier intervention, and so many more lives would have been saved as a result. And why did it have to take so long to then engage in a negotiated settlement with those who had caused the conflict?
The purpose of Dayton, the primary purpose of Dayton, was to end a war. And that's the title of his book, To End a War. The book was not entitled To End a War and Build a Country. It was just to end a war. So he wanted to stop the killing. And there was an urgency to it. And he will be the first to acknowledge, if he was alive today, that because of the urgency and because of the players involved at the time, and you had to get the agreement of the players, Milosevic, Izetbegovic, and Tudjman, he came up with the best he could to stop the war. And unfortunately, and he knew it at the time, it wasn't perfect. It was far from it.
None of us who were involved in this process thought this is a great idea, a way to run a country. But, it was the most that the parties could agree to at the time that would actually end the war.
Dayton kao sporazum ima svoje ograničenja, ali je Dayton manifestacija volja tri naroda koju imamo i koju moramo uvažavati, koju moramo prihvatiti. Da može biti bolji, može biti sigurno bolji. Da treba da bude bolji, sigurno da treba da bude bolji, ali po meni je koncept ideja i određeni stvari koje mi nosimo u glavi, predrasuda, nešto što nas ograničava da idemo dalje.
It is not enough to lead Bosnia into the future. I think one of the weakest points is that it really solidified the ethnic sort of structure in Bosnia, whereas it left out all so-called others. So everyone who feels anything other than the three main constituent groups or ethnic groups is basically sadly out of luck.
What I see is how Dayton has created these ethnic cylinders where, politicians use education as a divisive measure. There's actually some data coming out now where children in Republika Srpska don't know that Muslims live in their country because the curriculum and the textbooks they see have never acknowledged Muslims. So I think it's a very divisive issue. The way Dayton Accords were structured has made education a very divisive issue.
One of the challenges right now is we're in what I would argue is in a sub-Dayton phase, and that's a problem. And so we have to at least get back to Dayton to begin building off of it. And that's the challenge for the European Union. It needs to remember that Dayton has to be fixed and functioning before, in fact, we can start talking about handing over sovereignty to Europe.
As Richard Holbrooke described it in his book, it was 90% of the time over maps. It was 10%, and I'm pretty sure it was even less, about institutions, about the state institutions. They didn't care, and they know, how to play institutions. So they couched a deal in which it was from the beginning clear for them that the logic is how to use the state, or the unstate, I would call it, and not how to create a state.
There are a number of people who have a stake in the current system, who have a stake in continuing the corruption, who have a stake in utilizing the economic resources of the country to benefit more themselves or their parties, their narrow interest, than the broader interests of the people of Bosnia.
I think Bosnia is sort of stuck, and the political elites are not willing to change because it truly benefits them personally.
This is not anything subtle. These are people who are in positions of power who want to keep the status quo, and it's going to take a lot to change that.
We can't be talking about the requirements for what the European Union wants. We have to be talking about the requirements, what Bosnians need and want first. And until we resolve that question, fixing Bosnia for Europe is a secondary priority.
Mi možemo doći ovdje u Ameriku i vidjeti kako bi to trebalo da bude. Možemo da dobijemo savjet od njih šta treba da uradimo. Mislim da bi bilo pogrešno totalno da neko dođe sa strane i kaže da nam nas kroji, da napravi kako mi treba da živimo. Mi smo ti koji treba donosimo odluku, koji treba da se dogovorimo i da kažemo ok, to je to što želimo.
I am optimistic that change will take place. It's something that I hope that the people of Bosnia will actually start pressing for even more strongly than they have thus far. Not terribly confident in the ability of the international community to make the changes that need to be made. The people themselves really need to do more to hold their political leaders accountable and to help make the country more effective.
I think that the sooner people realize that the conflicts that are holding the country back are bad for everybody, that the sooner that we get to the next step, the step which young people will be able to use their skills and use their talents to be the next generation of leaders, then we'll see the new Beja coming, and the sooner the better. The sooner the better.
Frankly, I hope in 20 years we're just celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Dayton Peace Accords as the most successful diplomatic accomplishment in the last century.
Meanwhile, while we were at the conference, Spaho and Nick Levani were checking out Dayton. They saw some of the local sights and attractions, and, no surprise, they found both a brewery and a car museum to visit.
We are now in Packard Museum with beautiful car around, and this polite gentleman, he showed us car and history of each. So we started to speak about car and about things we got here. So let me ask you, Mr. Have you ever heard for Bosnia, our country we are coming from?
Oh, yes, quite familiar with that, and the peace accords that happened 20 years ago. It was quite a big media event here, and people watched the results very closely.
Walking around the streets of Dayton gave the guys a chance to find out more about the city and its people. And we started to wonder, what did people in Dayton know about Bosnia and about their city's role in the peace agreement? Some people knew more than others.
So in November of 1995, the Dayton Peace Agreement was signed here in Dayton, Ohio. Do you know which war this ended?
No.
No.
Do you know anything about the Dayton Peace Agreement?
I don't.
No.
Okay.
The Dayton Peace Agreement, it's not something that I've ever heard of, no.
What do you think of when you hear the words Bosnia and Herzegovina?
War-torn?
So in November of 1995, the Dayton Peace Agreement was signed here in Dayton, Ohio. Do you know which war this ended?
World War One. Yup. No, two. World War II.
What do I know about it now? I don't know much about it. I just know that Dayton Peace Bridge, for whatever reason, is a bridge that when it's a peace treaty that needs to be signed, people go to that bridge, or like they use that bridge to symbolically be the place where they sign the treaty.
The Dayton Peace Agreement, so it was a document where Bill Clinton and the Bosnians and the Serbs and Croats and other groups agreed to end the long so-called Bosnian War.
They ended a long-term war in that area, and Dayton was very instrumental in bringing peace together. They brought all the leaders here and at the Air Force Base, and we finally settled an agreement. That's one of the highlights of Dayton being a city that brought all these war people together and made an agreement with them.
Back at the conference, it was a big day, as Paya was invited to be on one of the panels and take part in the discussions.
What are you thinking? Pa ne mislim ništa, ne naspavan sam, umoran sam. Pun mi je
I'd like now to pass over to Pavle Fukarek, who is here described as the ex-professional soldier. But what I heard in my brief conversation with him is that he was indeed in war and he wore weapons, but he also replaced weapons with music after the war. So he has very rich career, lived in many countries in Europe, did different things, and I'm sure whatever you say will be of interest to the audience.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
in Bosnia, I don't think right now that exists one power of the people. I don't see no one who can empower the people to do something. 2 years ago we had a kind of protest. For 3 days we burned half of the building and burned 5 cars. That's all. After that, all those young people, after the protest, they went to the bar and put the pictures on Facebook and social media. Look what we have done in Sarajevo. I mean, in Bosnia we need a kind of revolution to change the things. We can't do the war again. Or, as I say before, forced political intervention by US. Europe can't help us. Europe is under the pressure of the refugees, bombs and everything, so next 5 years Europe will take care about themselves. I don't agree with my colleague, that something is heated under the pot. Something heated slowly. I don't think that there's people in Bosnia who is ready to do something, and people in Bosnia live under the low profile. If you ask them about politicians, they said they're corrupt, they steal the money. And one comment was for those protests 2 years ago, like, corrupt constructor pays some young people to burn the building so that corrupt politician can raise up corrupt tender and constructor will make his own money with them.
Sad će dođe predsjednik, Clinton dođe predsjednik. Ja ću da budem anoniman, dođe predsjednik da nam priča nešto, kaže ovdje, znaš? Ajde sad reži.
Who could possibly follow that? Yep, you guessed it. The keynote speaker was President Bill Clinton.
It is clear if we want a successful Bosnia and Herzegovina as a single, stable, prosperous democracy, there'll have to be continuing economic and political reforms, the reduction of corruption, the increase of genuine broad-based economic opportunity. It is wrong for any bloc to continue to seek political advantage through stalemate that robs young people of their possibilities in life. Bosnia is just as important as it ever was. It is the canary in the coal mine in terms of Europe's potential to be united, free, democratic, and at peace for the first time since nation states arose on the European continent. I remember how miserable Bosnian President Izetbegovic was when he had to initially deal on the 21st day of the agreement. Remember? And then he said, this is not a just agreement, but it is more just than a continuation of the war.
Our days in Dayton passed quickly, and before we knew it, the closing ceremonies were held at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where it all happened. We had a little time to walk around and see the places where the people who had been leading the war finally came to try to end it.
Ovdje su se oni prošetali, da se malo razbistre mozak, ne bi šta skuži, u stvari se razbistre ova dvojica što su vokali, ne bude lakše. I to je ti svog gdje su oni šetali i razmišljali kako će nas podijeliti, tako.
Ali napravili su je kriv da što duže šetaju.
Da što duže šetaju, ne bi bilo pametno.
Nije tako, nego Alija, Tuđman i Milošević.
Dobro.
Što mogu Aliju zadnjeg stavljati?
Dobro. Tuđman, Alija i Milošević. Uglavnom za ovog, kojeg za Aliju sam siguran da čovjek jedini bio trezven u tom trenutku. Ova dvojica definitivno, više manje. Za Slobu definitivno nije, on je bio raketiran. A Tuđman je bio na Vinčeko, lagano je to.
I onaj neko...
Znači, u Paki's bar. Šta mu je Paki? Ne znam, ali su nam ga zapakovali dobro.
We listened to some traditional music that definitely was not the music the guys would normally listen to. And after the official closing ceremonies, the guys decided one more ceremony was needed and reenacted the signing, but with a twist.
Mi ćemo sad simbolično da otpišemo Daytonski sporazum, on je potpisan prije 20 godina, mi ga otpisujemo, možda u nadi da će to simbolično pomoći da nam bude bolje. Evo ja potpisao, potpiši ti, hajmo.
A šta da potpišemo? Da ratujemo, jel?
Otpisujemo sporazum. Evo.
Alija desnu ruku, lijevom se guzica peri.
Samo još nešto. Evo, potpisali smo.
Samo sloga Srbina spašava. Ajde.
Za dom, spremni.
Šta kaže Alija?
Tekbir.
Tekbir. Slobodno reci Alija, neće nikad.
Ja napuštam.
We said goodbye to everyone we had met, had a few more laughs, and then it was time to go to our last stop, Washington, D.C. We went right into interviews with 4 people who had been involved in policy-making issues on Bosnia when the war started, and then when it finally ended.
My conclusion about Dayton, I think, became fairly quickly, and it is now, that Dayton was a successful failure. It stopped the ethnic cleansing. And that's what people cared about. That's what people were focused on. It stopped the killing. Did it bring justice to the country? I don't think so. But also, Dayton set up an impossible governing situation. Impossible. Now the dysfunctional Bosnian Dayton governance system, including its constitution, has been 20 years, and this is settled into the way of life for Bosnian politicians. They've all adjusted to it. They are making a lot of lucrative use out of it, shall we say, financially and politically. I actually think that for the American negotiators, for Holbrooke in particular, but on the American side, they were satisfied with a messy outcome, a mixed situation where there was no clear winner and loser. My recollection is that the agreement was not translated into Bosnian and published in Bosnian. I mean, it was obviously published in English and other languages, but it was not published in Bosnian because the late Mr. Izetbegovic and his colleagues realized the flaws in the agreement, the weaknesses, and they were afraid that they would face open rebellion on the part of their supporters.
As I got to know Dayton and understand it more intimately when I was working for the OSCE mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1996, I became very frustrated in the kind of the incentives in the agreement for dysfunction and blocking. I'm a little skeptical given of what I know of the international community and its lack of focus on the region, which is disconcerting to me, that they would kind of create an environment where there would be another Dayton. Yeah. And so I think that any reform that is going to happen is going to be incremental. If we had a constitution, still had a constitution within the peace agreement, but that there was a clause to say that within 10 years, right, that there needed to be a constitutional convention, right, which would require the involvement of all political parties that are represented in the varying levels of government, that it would include civil society organizations, and would have a consultation process with citizens, right, through town halls. I mean, as we know, politicians don't like to give up power, right? And unless, right, there's some pressure from, I think, both above and from below, it's just not going to happen.
What do you think about the Dayton Agreement?
Well, I think the Dayton Agreement was basically a piece of crap. But I think it was absolutely necessary as a vehicle to stop the war. Yeah. So I had this mixed feeling. I was not very particularly pleased with the agreement, as I said. I thought it was, but It did one very important thing, and I think everybody acknowledges that right now, that it was at least better to stop the war rather than to pursue it and get a better outcome. The Americans have abandoned it. The Europeans are hopeless. So I don't know how you do things that will produce a better arrangement than we have now. They thought it was a European issue, basically. And it is a European issue, but the Europeans weren't doing anything. It was sort of, would it detract from what the administration wanted to do? Didn't want to get involved, I'm repeating myself in a way, in terms of an uncertain situation in an area we knew little about, and which was principally a European problem, not an American problem. The Americans made it an American problem.
We still believed in those days, many of us, that it really mattered that people not be slaughtered, that civilians not be targeted, that Europe not repeat its history, that never again meant something. There were many people, I would say, there were enough people, maybe there were not enough, but there were some who believed, who were educated, who came to it somehow or other through their own experience, through their family experience, through their education, their historical imagination, that never again meant never again. But never again is not a winning policy argument in Washington or any other capital. We had a proposal from the French in 1990 to put in 10,000 preventive peacekeepers into Bosnia before there was any violence. And that was one of many policy wars that I was involved with, but to try to get the support for that. But that was rejected very, very, categorically by the Bush administration.
What do you think about this Dayton, Bosnia in the last 20 years? We said that we are blocked by the Dayton.
Right. Well, yeah, it's a straitjacket, isn't it? It locks in in most meaningful ways. It locks in a part economic, political, and security partition, and so it goes against what I think many of us understood the intervention was supposed to be about, and much more importantly, it was about what people on the ground were resisting and fighting for. You got to recognize when you're negotiating with the arsonist, and that the arsonist is not the fireman, and the arsonist is certainly not the insurance company, and certainly should not be allowed to collect on the insurance policy. If one or two sides of the negotiation, of the three sides, are very dug in and very determined, it's much easier to press your ally than your opponent. That's very diplomatic, a very diplomatic approach. It's one of the problems that I've always had with diplomats and diplomacy. They tend to squeeze the ally and the friend when they get down to the final stage. And that's exactly, of course, what happened to the Bosnians.
These interviews confirmed a lot of what we had been hearing all week about the time before the war and about the process that led to the peace talks. And no one seemed satisfied with where Dayton had brought us. After so much talking, we decided to clear our minds a bit with some sightseeing.
There's a hunger in the center of the chest. And there's a passage through the darkness and the mist. And though the body sleeps,
As we walked around the Washington Mall, the guys pointed out that a lot of the monuments seemed to be about war.
kraju našeg putovanja ispred rezidencije predsjednika Obame. Mala mu je kućica, mislio sam da je veća. Mala. Čeka da napravim sliku ja.
And then our trip came to an end. We came back to Sarajevo, recovered from jet lag, and took some time to think. We met up with some of the people who had helped us prepare for the trip. And while it was fun to tell them some stories, we didn't really have any answers for them. And then 1 year passed, and then 2, and then 3. Spaho moved to Italy, and then Slovenia. Nick Levani, Paja, and Kemo worked in Sarajevo and beyond. I went to Serbia, and then came back to Sarajevo. But Dayton stayed on our minds. Some of our Dayton friends came to visit, and we showed them what a real cookout in the hills around Sarajevo looks like. And politicians kept talking about Dayton every day. But there seemed to be less and less agreement on what Dayton even means. And all of this time, the rest of the world seemed to be falling apart. Dayton had its own challenges, including a tornado and a mass shooting that killed 9 people. And then in 2020, we started to wonder if a global pandemic would further delay this long overdue film project. What was happening? So as Dayton 25 approached, I asked Paja what he would say now if he went back to New York, to Dayton, or to Washington, D.C.
Ne bi ništa pitao. Zato što za svo ovo vrijeme, ovih 5 godina između one tamo konferencije, ovdje možda sad neke, što se kaže, za 1/4 stoljeća nakon famoznog potpisivanja, malo razmišljajući o tome, ja sam skonto da Dayton Agreement kao takav, on je na kraju krajeva okej. Sve je rečeno, uspjeh američke politike, zaustavljen rat, krvoproliće. I nama je ostavljeno u ruke 25 godina, evo sada da se mi uredimo. I evo kako je prošlo 5 godina od zadnjeg mitinga u Daytonu, proći još 5 godina i ništa vam novo neću ima da kažem. Isti ljudi, nekulturni političari, nepismeni političari, primitivizam među njima, strašno. U stvari bi im rekao, vi ste napravili dobru stvar, vi ste sve odradili. Ovo je sve do nas ovdje. Kratko i jasno. To je to.
Maybe Dayton never had the answers. Maybe what happened in Sarajevo in the early 1990s wasn't the last breath of the 20th century, but was really a warning, the first peek at the 21st century, about the dangers of divisive nationalism and the consequences of political manipulation in times of crisis. And 25 years later, maybe instead of looking for the answers in Dayton, maybe Sarajevo has something to teach all of us about our past, our present, and where we all want to be going.